Welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum podcast. Today we'll be continuing our three-part series with our second installment, diving into the start of World War II and the fall of Bataan and Corregidor and New Mexico's role within that. Today we also have Aaron Krebsbach, our collections manager, with us again. And so thank you for being on the show again today.
Thank you for having me.
So just diving in, why don't you kind of set the stage for us, and then we'll go into the finer details from there.
So last time we talked about the rise of Imperial Japan, from the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration, and the rise of Imperial Japan, and Japan trying to exert its holding within Asia. Then we covered U.S.-Japanese relationships and how they've kind of risen and fallen over that time frame, from Commodore Matthew Perry showing up with gunboat diplomacy, bringing the Pacific Fleet, pointing the guns at the palace, and opening up trade with Japan, not just for the U.S., but for the rest of the world. Japan had been isolated for hundreds of years. And then U.S. relations kind of rose and fall between there to World War I, the donation of the sakura trees that are currently in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. giving the dogwood tree. And then we also covered U.S.-Chinese relationships, U.S. interests in China, trade with China, the First and Second Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War. And then we kind of ended talking about the New Mexico National Guard with the 200th Coast Artillery. They're training at Fort Bliss. They're touring of New Mexico before shipping out to the Philippines. And the last we left them is they had arrived in the Philippines. They were settling in. They were defending Fort Stoutenburg and Clark Field just before the events of December 7th, 1941. So to pick up from there, as everybody knows, December 7th, 1941, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stated, the date that will live in infamy, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and decimates the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but they don't really quite make the targets they're after.
They don't have that killing stroke.
Exactly. They are after our three big aircraft carriers, one of them being the USS Enterprise. And they're not in port at Pearl Harbor at all. One of them is out to sea in the Pacific. Another is actually going through the Panama Canal at the time, I believe. I'd have to double check that. And the other one is actually in the Atlantic at the time. And so they miss our three major carriers. And so the U.S. air power is still viable, but the fleet itself, we lose several battleships are heavily damaged. We managed to repair most of them. But above all else, we lose some of our mightier battleships. The USS Arizona is completely decimated, sunk. They lose the majority of their crew. And on the USS Arizona is actually a couple of brothers from New Mexico. And they perish on the Arizona. They're not able to be rescued, and they end up dying on the Arizona. So on the other side of the world, the international date line is kind of like just past Hawaii. I forget the exact parallel that it's supposed to be, but it is the morning of December 8th, 1941. At about 3 a.m., so 0300 military time, the 200th is put on full alert in the Philippines. They man their guns at Clark Field, and they're preparing. Whereas later in the morning, you see Japan start to attack other Allied installations across the Pacific. So they attack Guam, they attack the Philippines, Singapore is attacked with the British, French Malaysia is attacked. They attack across all of it. Because in Japan's mind, I mean, the war is kind of stalled in China. And they end up attacking everybody. And nobody is thrilled with them. Even their allies, the Tripartite Pact, Italy and Germany, are not thrilled with the fact that they have now brought the U.S. into the war.
Which was something they were staunchly against.
Yeah, Hitler did not want the U.S. in the war at all. He knew that if with U.S. backing in the war would be make the war harder for him. Plus, he did not believe that the U.S. He considered the U.S. mutts. They were not the pure, strong Aryan that they believed in.
But he recognized the economic capabilities.
Yes, because we had been supplying scrap metal, fuel, and everything that Britain could possibly need to defend against the Blitz. And then we have the buildup of the U.S. fleet, in which the Battle of the Atlantic takes place through the course of the entire war. And we managed to, the Wolfpack tactics of Nazi Germany were very, very strong, but we were able to get enough men and material across. But back in the Pacific, we have, so because of fog at Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan, the Japanese do not take off to attack at roughly the time they were supposed to. So the attacks on Clark Field are delayed until about 12:35 Pacific Standard Time for the Philippines. And so the Japanese start their attack. The majority of B-17s at Clark Field are destroyed. Crews are folded into defense units as infantry because of this. Most of the P-40s that were scrambled when the Air Corps General finally got the word that he could scramble his P-40s and send them out to try and intercept, the majority of them never make it back. Mm-hmm. The P-40 is a strong plane. We did talk about a little bit about the Flying Tigers. They're flying the P-40, and they're able to, their main tactic is to dive away when they're attacked, but they're not going up against Zeros. They're going up against Nates and Kates. The Japanese Zero is a lot more nimble than the P-40 is. The 20mm cannon, it's argued back and forth how much more powerful than it is than a set of 50 cal machine guns. But the P-40s they're not as nimble as the Zero is. And so the Zero manages to use its nimbleness to overcome the P-40 and the early F4F Wildcats. Because of this, the U.S. would actually bulk up the P-40 a little more, and the Wildcat would actually be, they go back to Grenham, they go back and they completely restructure, rearm the Wildcat, and it becomes the F-6F Hellcat, which actually has the most number of air-to-air victories in the entire course of U.S. planes in the war. Don't get me wrong, I like the F-4U Corsair, but the Hellcat, because it was a carrier-based fighter and they were using it all the time, it was the main workhorse of the Navy.
And this was just a real eye-opening event for the Americans that says we need to come up with something better.
Yep, absolutely. And so bombers follow the Zeros as they come through and strafe and bomb the airfields. And because of the older technology that the U.S. is using at the time for the anti-aircraft, we can't hit the ceiling. The Betty Bomber is flying so high they can't hit the ceiling. However, Battery H out of Taos does manage to down a Japanese Zero when it comes in and tries to strafe the field. They actually down a Zero, and the 200th is credited with the first anti-aircraft unit to down an enemy plane for U.S. contact in the war. General Wainwright, who is just under General MacArthur in the Philippines, actually states, on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese unexpectedly attacked the Philippine Islands, the first point bombed was Fort Stoutenburg. The 200th Coast Artillery AA, assigned to defend this fort, was the first unit in the Philippines under the General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, to go into action and fire at the enemy, also the first one to go into action defending our flag in the Pacific. So you have high praise coming from, at the time, he was the second in command of the Philippines, General Wainwright. You have very high praise coming from him, and in turn it goes up to MacArthur, and they are actually highly, highly commended for their defense, their accuracy. Again, as we talked about last time, they get the Philippines because they're highly accurate. They perform very well.
So they put their skills on display.
Yep, their skills were more on display, and then they more than showed it when they stopped the strafing and managed to down at least one Japanese Zero. So the land invasion eventually begins up at the Bataan Islands. That's the northern part of the Philippines. It's just north of Luzon, not to be confused with the peninsula that we're going to be talking about later on. And so once air superiority was finally secured, they start their invasion of mainland Luzon. So the U.S. is about 151,000 men strong. They have about 108 tanks, 277 aircraft, of which the majority of them
have been destroyed.
There are a few stragglers here and there. Some of them end up fleeing to Australia. A few of them make it to the China-Burma Road, the China area, and fold in with some of the Flying Tigers, which the Flying Tigers actually end up being, once the U.S. has declared war officially, they're actually refolded. All the pilots of the Flying Tigers are refolded back into their original units. Marines go back to the Marine Corps. Air Corps pilots go back to the Air Force. General Claire Chennault is given command of the U.S. Air Corps in the Pacific. You see some of the greatest aces of World War II. Some of them were originally Flying Tigers. One of note, Gregory Bowington of the Black Sheep Squadron was originally a Flying Tiger. He's eventually awarded the Medal of Honor.
So we're just calling in anybody and everybody who has any experience.
Yep, and so it ends up being the U.S. is fairly strong, but like I said, the majority of their aircraft is gone in the Philippines. Air superiority becomes a major factor, especially as war shapes and changes. You get to Desert Storm, the U.S. quickly claims air superiority, and then you see this scene has been shown so many times, but the Death Highway, as Saddam's guard is trying to escape, they're continually bombed and strafed. Air superiority becomes a very, very key thing, starting actually kind of back in World War I-ish, but World War II really shows how air superiority and combined arms is very important. So the decimation of the aircraft at the Philippines kind of helps drive the way it goes, on top of the decimation of the fleet at Pearl Harbor.
So protection of the fleet, protection of the aircraft, and air superiority are lessons that the United States took very, very seriously.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so leading the U.S. forces, both the Filipino and U.S. regular and obviously National Guard, is General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur is the son of Arthur MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur was a general in the Civil War, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service during the Chattanooga campaign. He charged up Missionary Ridge, grabbed the U.S. colors after the colors fell, and started screaming, "On Wisconsin, on Wisconsin." MacArthur was actually awarded the Medal of Honor during the Banana Wars down in Central America. He also served in World War I, and so he is a very well-renowned general, being the son of another well-renowned general. And then under him you have General Jonathan Wainwright, who we spoke about very briefly earlier. And so General Wainwright is under General MacArthur, and he ends up in command of the Philippines when MacArthur is ordered out by President Roosevelt. And so he is a very good tactician, and he does the best he can with what he's given. On the other side, we have the Japanese, who actually come in at about 129,000 men, give or take a couple hundred. They only have 90 tanks, but they have 541 aircraft, and they're headed by General Masuhiro Homa. General Homa has been fighting in the Japanese Imperial Army for a very long time. He's a well-respected general.
He knows what he's doing.
He knows what he's doing. He's the man that they know can get the job done. But at the same time, he's got pressure, both politically from the Japanese military, Prime Minister Tojo, as well as he's getting pressure from the army and their panels to try and make sure he gets it done quickly and efficiently. And we're going to see this doesn't really go the way that they want it to.
They don't want him getting bogged down in a siege.
They don't want him getting bogged down in the Philippines. They don't, because they have bigger plans for Singapore and other parts of the Pacific. So General Homa is given this difficult task. What we also see happen now is on December 8th, we see that with all the strafing and all the bombing, there is now a noticeable issue with anti-aircraft, and the 200th is not enough to cover. I mean, they're covering their airfield really well, and you have other Army units who are part of other AA divisions doing the best they can, but there's not enough anti-aircraft to cover
everything.
Fields. So we see the birth of one of our first wartime divisions, the 515th Coast Artillery. And so what they do is from the 200th, because again, the 200th is very good at what they do, they take 20 officers and 500 men, and they are split off. So one of the people we know who was part of the 515th, Private First Class Thomas Vernon Long, who our exhibit is currently in the Bataan building as of today in 2025. He is one of the men who is split off from the 200th and taken to the 515th, and they are sent to defend Copcaban Airfield. And so command realizes the 200th is not large enough, nor is it strong enough to defend all the airfields on Luzon. The reserve units and the army units, who are also anti-aircraft, are not big enough to defend their own airfields. So the 515th is born, and PFC Long is taken out of his unit, men he has trained with for months, and a lot of the guys, so he comes from Portales, New Mexico. They were drafted together, they were trained together, they were deployed together.
These are his brothers.
They're his brothers, and so you see him being taken out of that and inserted to this another unit to try and help supplement. Even though he has been fighting with all these other guys because of the way the Army trains people, everybody is trained to do their job well. And so the 515th does their best. They are tasked with the defense of Cobb Caban Airfield, as well as the defense lines with the withdrawal to Bataan, which will eventually happen. So the main invasion begins on December 22nd, 1941, at La Union on Luzon. Again, forgive me for any Spanish pronunciation errors. Spanish is not one of my strongest languages. So General Wainwright is tasked with the defense of the landing. And because his forces are very poorly equipped, they are not able to hold the beachheads, and they're forced to retreat. And under his command is also the Filipino Scouts. The Filipino Scouts are considered one of the best regiments to come out of the Philippines. And so they are faced with the landings at Rosario, and they resist the landings very fiercely. They have decently high casualty rate. What they give is good as they get, but they're still forced to retreat after the significant casualties. So by December 23rd, the Japanese are already 10 miles into Luzon, which is we advance quickly out of Normandy. It just goes to show how quickly the Japanese are advancing into Luzon. So
They're pressing it hard.
They're pressing it very hard. And so General MacArthur looks at this and decides that the forces need to be consolidated. And he decides to go with War Plan Orange 3. So what is War Plan Orange 3? War Plan Orange 3 is basically turns the Bataan Peninsula into the Alamo. This is where we are going to hold. This is where we're going to sit. We're going to pull everybody back to Bataan and Corregidor. We will defend here until reinforcements and relief arrives with ammo, with food. So the food situation is not great. Initially, they're taken to half rations, and then within another couple days, they're told to half their rations again. So now they're on quarter rations,
which is just above starving.
Just above starving. So they're forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. They do the best they can to defend, and MacArthur calls for War Plan Orange. The 515th is moved in to cover retreat lines, stop Japanese strafing. The 200th is pulled back to Bataan itself, and anything that they can't take with them, it is asset denial. You destroy any tanks that you can't bring with you. The 192nd is actually from Janesville, Wisconsin. They are forced to destroy their tanks that they can't bring with them. The 515th and 200th, they are forced to destroy any AA guns they can't bring with them.
Don't give the Japanese American assets.
Do not give them anything you can. We'll revisit this after the fall of Corregidor, where they're told asset denial. And so they pull back to Bataan. On December 26, 1941, Manila is now declared an open city. What that means is there's no longer any military presence in there. It is fully a civilian city. There is nothing military in the city. It is now technically no longer a target of war. There's no material, no human beings, no arms, nothing. But the Japanese don't care. And they bomb Manila anyway, because General Homa is ordered to take Manila. Homa's advisors tell him that MacArthur is pulling back to Bataan and Corregidor. He is aware that this is going on, but pressure from his superiors, they told him to take Manila. So he does what he's ordered to do. And he doesn't attack the retreat lines. On January 2nd, 1942, the Japanese 14th Army marches into Manila and takes Manila. Well, now he is chastised by his superiors because all of the U.S. forces have withdrawn from the area and are now in Bataan, instead of attacking them when they were vulnerable, where they were just, basically harassing them, instead of doing a full-on attack and crippling them. He is completely chastised for his superiors for not both taking Manila
and harassing the Americans
and fully crushing what they're at. So he is blamed for the retreat to Bataan. So MacArthur and President Manuel Quezon of the Philippines is evac to Corregidor. And by January, the battle lines are drawn, and Bataan is now the last stand. So with where Bataan is and Corregidor is, it kind of creates this bottleneck for the Japanese. Yes, the Japanese have Manila, but where Corregidor Island and Bataan Peninsula is located, it is right at the entrance to Manila Bay. One thing the Americans learned during the Spanish-American War at the Battle of Manila is if you can choke off that point, you can stop anything from going on. And so they learned this because that's how they destroy the Spanish fleet. They destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines by doing exactly that. And so they plan to do the same thing to the Japanese. They bottleneck up at Corregidor and Bataan and stop the Japanese from taking their material and ammo and all their supply chains. They can't get it through Manila Bay. They have to go around, which means landing on other parts of the Philippines and then trucking it to where the battle lines are, which will slow down their supply chain, which hopefully would buy time. As we'll see, kind of works, kind of doesn't.
Mixed results.
It's a mixed results, but it stops the Japanese from getting a clear-cut hold on Manila. So now we have the Battle of Bataan. So the Bataan Peninsula, the U.S. draws their battle lines. They have about 120,000 men, both between the U.S. and Filipinos. They're short on rations. They're short on ammo. Most of the weapons they have, there are very few newer weapons. Most of them are World War I era weapons. Most of the guys are still using the M1903 Springfield, which, don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful weapon system. The U.S. proved its effectiveness both in the First World War as well as the Banana Wars down in Central America, as well as the usefulness of early American machine guns such as the Browning automatic rifle and the M1 Thompson. The Thompson, obviously, gangsters are using it, and the military eventually becomes convinced of its usefulness in war with its ability to fire a high rate of fire and give suppressing fire.
But those things just aren't capable of going up against the best of the Japanese had.
Exactly. The Japanese Arisaka, which is the main rifle that they're using a couple different versions of it. It is highly accurate. It is another good weapon system. But the Japanese are also their Type 99 machine guns and Type 100 submachine guns that will eventually be a mainstay within their military, is enough to outpace what they're doing. Plus, the Japanese have been fighting the Second Sino-Japanese War for years. These are highly trained to the best of their ability troops, and that's the reason they were chosen. The 14th Army was chosen to take the Philippines. It's because of their war record. So, the U.S., though, the morale is starting to waver. They're being told over and over, hold out, help is coming. Hold out, help is coming. Food is coming. Ammo is coming. When in reality,
nothing was coming.
Nothing's coming. The U.S. Pacific Fleet has been decimated. Most of the battleship capability has been decimated. Yes, cruisers and destroyers, they're great escorts, but they don't have the capacity to haul all the weaponry that is needed. Yeah, they can haul weaponry and rations and all that, just not to the scale in their cargo bays that bigger ships can. So you have to protect the supply ships.
Yeah, you can't supply 120,000 men on what you can bring over in those vessels.
Yeah. I mean, they're powerful weapon platforms, really good at defense, but the battleship is really the backbone of Navy at the time. Now, as we're going to see later in the war, plane against a battleship. For some reason, this more nimble thing, because it can fly, beats the battleship. That's why we see the sinking of the Yamamoto by the U.S. They sink the Japanese most mighty battleship. And you also see World War II and World War I era planes sink the mighty Bismarck over in the Atlantic. So the battleship eventually will no longer be the mighty weapon of the Navy. The aircraft carrier will be. But at this point, naval doctrine still, the battleship is the backbone. The battleship is part of any escort fleet. The USS New Mexico is actually used as an escort vessel for the first part of the war and helps supply the Aleutian Islands, where, as we talked earlier, the Arkansas Regiment, they're defending the Aleutians, and they're being hit pretty hard as well. But the Japanese, when they attacked, they've dwindled down to about 75,000 men just in that area. And they're well trained, they're well equipped, their supply chain is flowing very well, and they have now blockaded the island. But they cannot access Manila Bay because of the coast artillery at Corregidor.
So it's a stalemate.
It is kind of a stalemate, but it's leaning more towards the Japanese. The Japanese, they're able to resupply their troops. They're able to get fresh troops in. So you see a line form between Mauban and Bataan. Again, I apologize for Spanish pronunciations. And it's about a 15-mile line from one side of the peninsula to the other in these two cities. So the I Corps, or First Corps, is at Bataan. It's on the eastern part of Bataan, and it's under the command of General Wainwright. And he has command of several of the Philippine infantry regiments, several U.S. Army regiments, the 26 Filipino Scouts cavalry, as well as a battery of 75mm guns. Second Corps at Mauban is on the west side of Bataan, and they're under control of General Parker, General George M. Parker. And he's got, again, a couple of different infantry units. Mount Natib is the anchor for the flanks. It is the anchor for the western flank of I Corps and the anchor for the eastern flank of II Corps. And it's a mountain that the U.S. thought the Japanese wouldn't attempt to scale. So you have this gap between the two corps. And anybody knows if you've got a gap in your lines, somebody's going to attempt to push through whether or not you think it's passable or not. We'll learn that the Japanese realize we can get through this, and they're not afraid to scale the mountain. Tanks are spread throughout the lines. The tank battalions are given the best they can with what they've got left. They're using the M3 Stuart, which is a light tank. We'll actually use it through the majority of the war, and it's actually pretty good when it comes to the jungle combat of the Pacific War. And the artillery is put in the rear. The 515th and 200th, what few guns are left are used for anti-aircraft, and then the main artillery is put on the high ground with great vantage point for the 155 howitzers. They can seal them to the best of their abilities, and they actually manage to hold off and stop early attacks by the Japanese. So General Homa's 48th Infantry ends up coming up. He loses a couple of his best battalions from the 14th, and they're actually sent for the invasion of Java and Singapore. And so the new division he gets in is the 65th Brigade. They're actually a reserve unit. They're not as well trained as the men he had before, which is going to factor into how some of this plays out. They're under the command of Akira Nara. They were originally used as a garrison unit until they were attacked, and because of their garrison unit designation, this causes high casualties. They're not originally a combat unit, and this ends up proving fatal for this unit. And so the Japanese are using the Type 97 Chiha tank. It's not nearly as good as the Stuart. Japanese warfare, again, you see this slip back into more of a man charge. You have banzai attacks, all of that at the beginning of the war. But they do understand the use of the tank, and they actually repair and repurpose some of the M3 Stuarts that were attempted to be asset denial, but the Japanese managed to repair them and use them themselves. At the start of the Battle of Bataan, the Japanese do not have a lot of artillery. They brought very few with them. They had very poor maps of the area for concentrated fire, and this also contributed to their slow advance. They begin their attack in January. On January 12th, General Parker is forced to move up the 21st Infantry from his reserves on 2 Corps. They're to support the 57th, who are getting hit pretty hard by the Japanese. And it ends up their attack ends up causing some gaps in the line, which are actually filled out by the 52nd, who are also in reserve. On the 14th of January, because the 2nd Corps is getting hit pretty hard, the 1st Corps is forced to move one of their regiments over into support and to close the gaps that are being formed in 2nd Corps. And eventually, it is realized that the Japanese are trying to push up this gap in the mountain. And so in an attempt to close the gap, the U.S. ends up moving a couple of the scout regiments and from I Corps into this gap and to try and fill it and stop the Japanese. On January 16th, the Japanese had let up just a little bit, and General Park orders a counterattack of the 51st. The attack is repelled pretty well by the 141st Japanese Infantry and the 9th Japanese Infantry on the left flank, in which, because of this counterattack not going well, it forms another hole in the line of 2nd Corps. The problem is the Japanese, they see this hole, and instead of doing what you should do when you see a hole in the line, take full advantage, push through, and cause a breakdown of the lines, the Japanese don't. The 141st turns and attacks the 41st Division, and the 9th Corps tries to get their way up the mountain. And the 53rd is ordered to retreat and to link up with I Corps, and the Japanese move in their artillery, and I Corps, the 2nd Corps, is basically starting to dissolve, and so they fall back, regroup. On the other side of the peninsula, roughly at the same time, the Japanese will attack I Corps. I Corps fares a little bit better, but not much better. Again, we're running low on ammo, we're running low on rations. Beriberi and malaria are decimating all U.S. forces in the area. On January 10th, the Japanese are occupying the Grand Islands and Olugapo. And on the 15th, General Homa actually gives responsibility of taking Western Bataan to one of his staff officers, General Nakio Kimura. And so General Wainwright's forces are attacked on the 16th at Moran. Wainwright ends up moving his 76th Infantry into Pillar Bach Road and behind the defenses. And by the 25th, I Corps is in retreat. They're not able to hold at Mauben. So we see this fallback behind and reform of the lines. And then we have a couple of the biggest battles of Bataan before the actual final stand at Bataan. So one of those battles is the Battle of the Points. The Japanese are trying to outflank the Americans. And so they try and send around to Logos Kwan Point, Kwan Point, and as well as Silam Anasaya. Again, I am not great with pronunciations. The Japanese 20th Infantry, 1st and 2nd Battalion end up being destroyed by this attack. It is, like I said, it is an attempt to outflank I Corps, and it does not go well for them. A lot of their barges and transports intercepted by U.S. torpedo boats and patrol boats. So PT-34 ends up sinking 2 of these boats, and it scatters a 900-man strong battalion, and only 300 land where they're supposed to at Logosquan, and only 600 land at Quinan. So the landings are very much contained, and we have a Navy detachment who is doing their best to help defend this. So we have the Navy detachment. About 80 of them are formed from this ammo depot in the USS Canopus, and so we have 120 Marines who form an AA battery. So these guys, they're wearing your standard Navy whites. So to try and blend in a little more, they actually end up trying to dye their uniforms using coffee grounds, and it came out more yellow than khaki.
Not exactly the look you're going for.
No, it's not the look you're going for. And so as the Japanese see these guys, a diary from a Japanese officer describes them actually as a suicide squad, dressed brightly, talking loudly to draw fire, to reveal enemy positions. So the Battle of the Points does not go well for the Japanese, even though you have these guys who are dressed in brightly colored uniforms that stick out against the jungle. They still manage to repel the Japanese. And so the Japanese end up retreating northward, and they give up on trying to take the points. So the line holds, which is spectacular given the low ammo, lots of disease, and not much.
It's really a testament to those who are holding the line.
Exactly. And so you have the Battle of Two Trails, in which the Japanese are ordered to pursue the retreating U.S. And so they advance on the Oran-Bagak line, thinking it was the outer line, and it ends up being turned back by a counteroffensive. And then you have probably one of the bigger attacks attempted by the Japanese. We have the Battle of the Pockets. So the Japanese managed to push through and create these small and large pockets within the American lines. And when you have a pocket within your enemy lines, you want to hold it and widen it, so eventually it pushes the line back and you can advance. Great tactic attempt, does not go well for the Japanese at all. They break through the 1st Division, and they break into 2 pockets. You have the little pocket with 1 company, and then you have the big pocket, which has about 1,000 men. On February 5th, General Wainwright orders the elimination of these pockets. He knows it's going to play hell with the supply lines. It's going to wane morale more than it already is, and you don't want your enemy back within your back flank. So 5 companies of the 1st Division and 2 companies in the 92nd Infantry Battalion and a couple other companies are ordered to close these pockets. So on February 6th, a salient is formed in the upper pocket, and the 1st Division will surround the smaller pocket on February 7th. And they will give it their all, and it takes them 2 days to actually eliminate the small pocket. This entire company of Japanese is wiped out and eliminates the small pocket, but it takes 2 days. You have an entire division up against the company. So say what you want about the Japanese, they were fierce fighters, and they held up for 2 days at a company. By February 9th, the small pocket is gone, which allows the concentration on the larger pocket. And so they cut them off completely. So it is no longer a fueled-in pocket, but an enclosed and encircled pocket. The trail is closed off to them by February 10th. On February 11th, their commanding officer, Yoshioka, tries to break out north in conjunction with the General Fourth Army withdrawal from the area. He makes his attempt over and over, and he's finally successful on February 15th. 377 of the original 1,000 in the large pocket managed to make it out and return to their lines. And on February 26th, first course line is completely restored. So the Japanese have tried multiple times to break through the lines. So now we have the U.S. has now pulled back. We have the Orion-Bacog line. On February 8th, General Homa had actually called a halt to his attacks. He only had 3 effective battalions, and he retreats to a better position 10 kilometers from the front, and he awaits reinforcements. And while this is going on, the Battle of the Pockets is going on. So this is a conjunction thing, which is why Yoshioka tries to link up with the 14th, because they're pulling back to General Homa's new line. On the U.S. side, the defenders are starving. Like I said, they have been cut down, rations have been cut down, and they're in this small area. On January 17th, MacArthur had actually radioed Washington saying that the feud situation here has become serious. An army marches on its stomach. It's what makes supply extremely, extremely important, not just to get you weapons and guns, but to feed your army. Which is why, if we rewind a little bit in U.S. history, it was surprising that General Sherman, in his march to the sea and his making the South and Atlanta howl, he cut off his supply lines. He ordered his men to ditch anything that wasn't food, ammo, and a basic blanket, and they basically lived off the land and cut their supply lines. And the fact he managed to do it successfully
It's very rare.
is very rare. But if we fast forward back to the U.S. defense of the Philippines, because of the development of the Philippines and the way that things are going, and you have ships constantly coming and going around the island, it's hard to get the supplies you need, especially when the Japanese have cut you off. So on February 20th, there is actually an evacuation ordered on the USS Swordfish, which is a submarine. It is SS-193, in which most of the Philippine government is evacuated. And so you have President Quinzon and his family are evacuated. The VP is evacuated. The Chief Justice and 3 major intelligence army officers are evacuated. 2 days later, MacArthur is ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines. Now, this is where MacArthur really becomes a controversial figure when it comes to the defense of the Philippines. MacArthur is ordered to leave, and he doesn't. He stays, and he says he's going to stay with his men. But if you fast forward almost a month, things will change. So at the same time that this is going on February 23rd, General Homa receives his reinforcements, and he actually ends up dismissing his chief of staff, Masashi Medea, and gets a new chief of staff, Takachi Wachi, and that comes with all of his reinforcements. So the Japanese are now preparing for another attack. More men and artillery are brought in, and they use this to decimate the U.S. artillery and AA capability. The 22nd Airborne Brigade is reinforced, and heavy bombers are brought in. And so you now see the Japanese are bulking up, and they're preparing for their final push to eliminate the U.S. from Bataan.
Putting all their cards on the table.
Yep. They're at the point, this is taking too long. General Homa is drawing a lot of men and material, and the Japanese have decided enough is enough. This needs to stop. We have other plans that need to be set in motion, and this is being hung up.
Wipe them off the face of the map if you have to.
Yep. So you see heavy artillery attacks on the lines. You see heavy bombing. The last of the planes that are in the area are doing their best to try and hold this off. But when you have a handful of planes against constant bombing, it doesn't necessarily go well. And so again, President Roosevelt orders MacArthur out of the Philippines. And finally, on March 12th, he leaves. And many felt betrayed by this. They felt that MacArthur had told them that he was going to stay with them, he was going to defend them. He showed up, he left Corregidor a couple times to actually come to Bataan and look over the situation. and be a presence for his men. But he left Corregidor by PT boat to Mindanao, where he was flown to Australia with his family. And so things are shifted, and General Wainwright is put in command. Wainwright is pulled off of Bataan, goes to Corregidor, and in his place, he puts General Edward King. So General King is in charge of Luzon, and under him you have General Jones, who is now in charge of I Corps. General Parker is still in command of II Corps. And General MacArthur is now being flown to Australia. On March 17th, General Wainwright is notified that MacArthur has arrived in Australia. And a few days later, General King ends up receiving a message from the Japanese offering an honorable surrender, citing the defeat of Britain and the Netherlands in the East Indies. So while they're hung up in the Philippines, Japan has managed to take the East Indies from Britain and the Dutch. So General Homa believed it would take a month to take the peninsula, and on May 23rd, more heavy aerial bombardment starts. So this is kind of the last swan song for Bataan. These men have been pushed to the brink. They're doing the best they can to defend, and it is not necessarily going well for them, and they're being lied to over and over that relief is coming. So in that, you see some famous poems come out of it, such as The Battling Bastards of Bataan. You see artwork come out of it. These guys feel like now that MacArthur is gone, we've been forgotten about, we're going to be abandoned, and we're stuck fighting against this enemy who is giving absolutely no quarter. So the lines are pushed back to the edge of the peninsula, and the attack begins to collapse the line on April 3rd. The 4th Division is sent against the II Corps' flank at Mount Samat. 65th Brigade is on the 4th's right flank, and the 21st Japanese Division is on II Corps' right flank. By the end of April 3rd, the U.S. is now in retreat. On April 4th, the 65th continues their advance south, and the 41st will continue. The 41st U.S. will continue their retreat. General King will commit his reserve forces to stop the fall of the sector to the best of his ability. But again, low ammo, low rations. Things are not going well in Bataan.
Very low morale.
Yep. On April 5th, the Japanese take Mount Samat. And General Wainwright orders a counterattack. And on the 6th, the counterattack is pushed through. And it fails completely and totally. The men are fatigued, they're ill, they're hungry, and they're forced back to the east bank of the San Vicente River. According to General Wainwright, the Japanese have destroyed 2 divisions of the 21st and 41st, 1 regiment. The 51st is cut off. They've cut off 2 regiments to the main areas. The 41st and 45th Infantry are isolated, and II Corps' left flank has been smashed and split away. Artillery is neutralized, and General Parker's rear is open. All of that listing basically says in one thing: this is almost over, and we are almost done. So on April 7th, the San Vicente line crashes and collapses, and there's a firing retreat across the Mamala River. I Corps will continue their retreat, and what General Homa expected him to take a month is now taken 5 days. So how did he come up with a month and end up with 5 days? Well, you have the fierce fighting over the past couple months. So remember, the war starts December 7th for the U.S. We are now April of 1942. That is 4 or 5 months of fierce fighting, which is why General Homa thought it would take him a month. And that's what he had told command. And it has now taken him 5 days because the U.S. is out of ammo. The U.S. is basically out of rations.
Our boys are dead.
Things are done. On April 8th, General King finally looks at the situation, decides it is dire enough, and he is going to surrender. General Wainwright radios MacArthur in Australia and tells him that the men are too weak and too malnourished to resist. And so they prepare Bataan to surrender. What that means is nurses are evacuated to Corregidor, and they leave 24,000 sick and wounded on Bataan. Asset denial is put in place. Destroy any weapons, ammo, and supplies that the Japanese could possibly use. You have the detonation of the remaining arsenal dumps, and you have men destroying their weapons. At Cobb Command Airfield, the last of the remaining U.S. air power, well, if they could really call it air power at that point, it's two P-40s, a single P-35, and a single Grunham J-2F Duck, which is basically a scout plane. They leave. The last 3 ships that are left are scuttled. They're completely made inoperable, which is the Dewey, which is a dock ship meant to repair other ships, the Bittern, which is a minesweeper, and of course the Canopus, which is the submarine. The remnants of I Corps and the devastated 2 Corps retreat to the rear, and anyone who did not want to surrender either fled to Corregidor or disappeared into the jungle with the Philippines and would join the guerrillas. The guerrillas would become important as the Japanese try to exert their control over the Philippines, and the U.S. soldiers who decided not to surrender, many of them would join these resistance movements to the best of their ability. So on April 9th, 1942, Bataan is surrendered. General King surrenders to Colonel Mato Nakayama, and he tells him that he is surrendering just Bataan. He is not surrendering all the Philippines. General King doesn't have the authority to surrender all the Philippines, and he tells him this. But Nakayama tells him flat out that he needs to surrender, complete and total surrender of the Philippines, what General King cannot give him. So General King is taken to the Balanaka Elementary School for questioning, and they photograph him and his staff officers to prove this surrender. So now the U.S. is technically no longer on Luzon Island. They have now been pushed away, which brings to the Battle of the Corregidor. This is General Homa's last leg to secure the Philippines, and Corregidor has been bombed over and over in an attempt to knock out the coast artillery and knock out U.S. resistance so that they can sail into Manila Bay and go into Manila and take and supply more easily. So on February 3rd, the USS Trout, which is another submarine, arrives with supplies and leaves with all the Filipino gold and silver that the banks have left. And then the siege starts on April 8th. The 60th Coast Artillery arrives from Bataan. On April 8th, the 60th Coast Artillery arrives from Bataan, and the Japanese will start to shell the island after Bataan surrenders immediately. General Wainwright ordered a hold on counter battery fire for 3 days. The reason for this is because he doesn't want to accidentally shell remaining U.S. troops who have surrendered and accidentally kill guys that are there who have surrendered. So they wait 3 days. In the meantime, while they're waiting, the Japanese are bombing and shelling the island 24/7. On April 14th, all northern batteries of Corregidor are no longer operable. By April 24th, Battery Crockett is put out of commission, which is Battery C. And on April 29th, 2 Navy planes fly 50 nurses and a lot of the HQ staffers out of Corregidor. So by May 1st, most of the batteries at Corregidor have been silenced. So on May 4th, the USS Spearfish evacuates 25 more personnel and the last mailbag to leave the Philippines. This mailbag basically contains the last correspondence many people will hear from their loved ones who are in the Philippines. Some of them get it a little earlier. For example, Eret Lujan's family receives it at the end of 1945. It's the last time they hear from Eret. PFC Long's family, the last time they hear from him is they get a letter on Christmas Eve. Now, keep in mind, as we had mentioned, on Christmas Eve, the 515th is being moved in position to defend the retreat lines. But this last mailbag is the last many of them will hear from anybody else. And with the rate of mail at the time, they'll probably receive it a month later. So on May 5th, there were only 3 of the 155 millimeter guns operational. The majority of the batteries were knocked out, as I had stated earlier. And the Japanese forced their boarding craft and barges to make landfall at Corregidor. And intense shelling happens to clear the beach of these men landing. At 11 p.m., the Japanese are pushing up the beachhead. On May 6th, they managed to push into the main batteries. At about 2 a.m., the reservists are sent up to support, and the Japanese are fiercely holding on to their foothold on Corregidor, even with the support. And General Wainwright eventually sees that there's no way. The Japanese are landing more and more men on Corregidor, and this small garrison is not going to be able to hold. So at 10:15, he orders the surrender to be broadcast, and the fall of the Philippines happens. So Corregidor POWs are surrendered, but they are not subjected to the death march that the surrenders at Bataan are. They're actually sent to Bataan to collect the dead, and so the Japanese dead are cremated, as is the Shinto views of the majority of the Japanese at the time, and the U.S. and Filipino dead are buried. So the Filipinos are offloaded at a dock, and U.S. prisoners are paraded down Dewey Boulevard to Bilibid Prison. Some of them are sent to Cabanatuan Camp Number 3. On July, the Angels of Bataan nurses, who were the nurses who decided to stay and tend, are sent to Santo Tomas Internment Camp, and the U.S. forces are basically now fully captured, and the Philippines have fallen. So the Japanese, they set up a puppet state. Most Filipinos will actually remain loyal to the U.S., even with the U.S. having the U.S.-Filipino War not long before. They'll remain loyal to the U.S. because better to be with the U.S. than the harsh treatment the Japanese are putting them under. The Japanese will force the Filipinos into some very, very harsh conditions. Many are killed and also forced to become comfort women, and many are also raped to death. And those who refuse are just outright killed.
So truly horrific.
Yeah,
conditions.
it is. They treat the Filipinos horribly. Other war crimes that are imparted upon the Filipinos are also, they use them for human experimentation. And those who are a part of that, after their experiment is done, they kill them. The Japanese are very, very harsh with what they do to the Filipinos.
It really throws a contrast in between the United States and the Japanese in this light.
Absolutely. But a resistance movement still forms. Because just like with the French, when the Germans take Paris and set up the Vichy government, the French are not going to completely roll over and stand for it. And they harass the Germans at every opportunity. The Filipinos do the same thing to try and force out the Japanese. And just how effective the Filipino guerrillas are, 12 of the 48 provinces are under control of the Japanese totally. 12 of 48 provinces in the Philippines are under complete Japanese control, which means the guerrillas have control of the rest of them. Yes, there's a Japanese presence in the other provinces, but the influence is mainly swaying to the guerrillas. And so the Japanese bring in the Kamputai to try and root out the leaders and to squash this resistance. So, what what good comes out of the defense of the Philippines? Not much, but enough to make a difference. First off, it took longer than the Japanese expected. They thought they would be done in the matter of weeks to maybe a month or two. December 1941 to May of 1942. 5 to 6 months to take the Philippine Islands. This shifts troops that were bound for Java, Borneo, and other assets in the Pacific to the Philippines. It slows the advances in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, which takes some pressure off of Australia. It also allows for General MacArthur to get set up in Australia and prepare for what will be the eventual island hopping campaign of the Pacific. And it allows for the setup of the Philippine guerrillas. So while the Japanese are still trying to put down the Americans, the guerrilla sects are forming. And as we mentioned, they're very effective.
It essentially stalled them long enough for the resistance movements and everyone else to get established for the counterattack.
Yep. So, and that is the fall of the Philippines. So that's basically where we'll leave it at this point. That'll close out this section. The U.S. did the best they could with what they had. And again, asset denial. When they surrender, destroy as much as you can and hold out hope that eventually rescue will come for POWs.
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you again for being with us today and really walking us through that story and bringing to light a lot of these aspects of the war that aren't discussed in a great amount of detail until more recently in a wider audience. So thank you for that.